Let me just start off with again, this is going to be covered in a couple of chapters in the upcoming book, but want to start to share some of this data. I think it's important for us to do. So we'll start off with just a short, and this is a short list of some of the breaches that have happened with third parties, clouds, and how the point I try to make with this one is, if you go down the list of vendors here on the left side, or sorry, companies on the left side here, what you end up seeing is actually these are the companies that were using a third party with the cloud, with their data in the cloud, that got breached, but the breach is still associated with the original company, right? And so while we think we're offloading some of that risk sometimes when we put things in the cloud, it actually increases that risk in some areas. And in fact, when a breach happens, it often is forgotten what the third party in the cloud was, and it's really assigned to the company that originally was using the data for their customers. So I'm not going to go through this list. Most of us have seen some of these or are familiar with some of these, but these are some of the high interest ones. There's plenty of others that we could go through. I think the biggest issue and the biggest complexity issue around this is the shared responsibility model for third parties. Most of us are at least familiar with that shared responsibility model, and how, based upon the shared responsibility or the deployment they're using, whether it's IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS, that responsibility becomes either the cloud vendors or the cloud customer. But when you outsource to a vendor and they use another vendor in the cloud to do it, it gets even trickier, because you're now trusting a fourth party, and you're trusting a third party to do the right thing in their cloud for your data. So some of the first steps you can do is to ensure that the data remains yours. So when you're doing contracts and negotiations, ensure that the data remains the company that you're representing with the vendor, that you retain ownership of that data. Okay. Ensure that data privacy is addressed. Of course, data privacy and data security are two separate things. And often the data privacy issue gets missed in the negotiations. You concentrate on the data security, which is certainly important, but data privacy, the collection and use and retention of that data on data privacy is a different subject than a data security. So make sure that that's being addressed. Obviously, identify how identity access management is being done for the cloud in this instance with your data through the vendor. How are they getting access? What's the privilege access level? Are they doing multi-factor authentication for privilege access and so forth? And then, of course, you could do this first or last, but you need to identify the shared responsibility that's being used by your vendor. So if your vendor is using the cloud vendor for PaaS, that establish that shared responsibility and understand with them how they're taking ownership of the areas that they're supposed to do as the cloud customer in this case. All right. Okay. A big tool, and I can really only focus here on the top three. There's other vendors or sort of other cloud service providers that do this, that do security advisory reports. But on the big three, on the AWS, on Amazon Web Services, it's a trusted advisory report. It is perfectly reasonable to ask your vendor for the trusted advisory report for the solution that they're providing. They can redact certain sensitive things like IP addresses and unique names that would give some discomfort to them from a security perspective. But the trusted advisor report is going to give you, as the customer, the vendor's security configurations they're doing in AWS. So work with them. It may often has to be a conversation on a phone, because they want the comfort that you're not going to take this trusted advisor report and do something nefarious with it, obviously. But you can negotiate around. Hey, you can redact the areas that you feel are sensitive, and if in the end you feel that those shouldn't be sensitive, again, that can be a follow-up conversation. But there's perfectly reasonable ask for a trusted advisory report. In Azure, I think the it's Advisor now. I think they've changed the name. It used to be, I think, Security Central or something. These, and this applies to any of these cloud service providers. They often will change the name of the product or the subservice that they offer. But there's a security tab and Advisor on Azure that again will produce a security advisor report that is consumable by you as a customer. And again, you can have them redact certain areas that are sensitive to them from a confidentiality standpoint. And on the Google, it's the Security Command Center, and same thing. It produces a lot of the same information that is on the Trusted Advisor report. All of these cloud service providers, big three as they were, will have how-tos and knowledge base on how these things should be configured and what key areas you'd want to be looking at. Obviously, it will depend on the risk profile and risk appetite for your particular firm, but be it to say things like, looking for, they do have MFA enabled for root account, root access or privilege access. How are there public IPs available? Are there SQL databases that are publicly available? And S3 buckets, depending again on the solution you've picked for the what your vendors picked for the solution for their cloud service provider. Okay. All right. For those who aren't familiar with security architecture will often produce what are called patterns. And patterns, if you're not familiar with them, think of them as templates or checklists or benchmarks for how you can provide in this case, an internal business partner or a vendor with a list of things that you expect them to do for how they're going to implement a particular service or product. In this case, it's around cloud security. And so there are a number of baselines. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are just some examples that I expand on. But any of these items, depending on what your particular firm is most comfortable with, could use any of these or others that you can then present to your vendor when you find out that they're going to be using a cloud service provider to help them understand what you expect for security controls. This kind of helps in a number of ways. One is it establishes internally with your internal business partners what you're expecting of vendors who use cloud. It also makes it easier for a vendor who does use a cloud service provider to understand what you expect, and you don't have to repeat or ad hoc at every time. You could say you may pick one, or you may pick more depending on what the situation is. Like if it's a HIPAA, you may want to use if you know it's going to be a HIPAA deployment, you may want to use the high trust CSF as your pattern. Or if it's going to be the AWS, you could use the Center for Information Security's AWS Foundation benchmark as an example. So again, this just provides you a repeatable process, both internally and externally, for onboarding and communicating risk controls or security controls for cloud deployments of your data. Another one that is a little bit more complex to initiate with your vendor, but it's certainly a possible, and one that I can give some advice on how to do that, is the cloud service providers APIs. They all I'm just going to go through the two here on AWS and Azure, that they all provide REST APIs for specific security controls. And with the proper negotiations and proper understanding of what the responsibilities are, you could get those alerts yourself as a customer of the vendor and their cloud deployment. And an example would be, let's say on the AWS side, let's say that one of the alerts that you have the API set up for is if somebody disables multi-factor authentication for privileged accounts or root access. The API can just alert you that, and obviously the vendor, that's been disabled for some reason. Again, the root cause will happen after that, but it can take the form of just alerting you, and then you can get on the phone with the vendor and say, hey, are you aware of this and what are you doing about it? Or it could even, you could even have it re-enable the MFA, and then you can go find out who disabled it. And again, similar process with Azure. The challenge here, of course, is getting a vendor to agree to do this. And so usually what I recommend is try and find a way, when you get this level of information, cooperation, transparency with a vendor, use a reward to entice participation. Like for instance, let's say with this vendor, because of the risk, that you want to go and do an on-site assessment or a due diligence assessment every year. you might say, hey, we could go to every 2 years if you're more transparent with us about what's going on in the cloud and where their data is. So again, again, this will depend on your risk appetite and how you approach risk in the cloud at your individual company. But it does offer some opportunities for you to get more transparency, quicker response, and a better transparency on what's going on in the cloud for your third parties. There is a way to do cloud software testing, and again, this is critically important given some of the issues that have gone on recently around software vulnerabilities. So ensure that when you're negotiating with your vendor that you get a sandbox or testing environment, that you yourself can do tests about the application security. There's two ways that I've talked about here on testing in a web environment is static analysis and dynamic testing. And in particular on APIs, you want to just check on input validation. There's other things you can do, but these are the things that I think are kind of critically important is input validation on APIs, signatures, making sure that the authenticity of the software is being verified with a signature. And then look at strings for inference attacks. On the dynamic testing side, you'd want to look at memory and any potential data leakage. Registry, if the software is doing an unexpected behavior and changing registry. And then on the network side, you want to look and see is it possible for a user to get in there on the network and escalate their account and get escalated privileges. So these are just some fairly straightforward ways that you can do and take the responsibility for testing the software and not just trust, caveat emptor, trust the vendor is doing the right testing. You should dive into it and do your own testing. But again, do it in a sandbox or testing environment, obviously for reasons that are probably readily apparent to most of the folks on this call. Lastly, there's legal protections in language that you should have either in an information security addendum, a hosted addendum, or in the master service agreement, however your particular organization wants to wrap it up into a document. But it should definitely deal with encryption, right? You should have minimum expectations that the data will be encrypted both in transit, at rest, and in use. You should have a particular language around a requirement for multi-factor authentication, privileged accounts. Clearly, that's been an issue ongoing in breaches. Right to review security reports annually. Again, the security reports we talked about earlier, the TAR and the other ones in Azure and Google, you should be able to review those on an annual basis, depending on the risk that particular vendor presents to your organization. So you can just check that those things haven't changed over time. Web application firewalls. It seems like a fairly straightforward thing, and most folks would agree that it's required. But we've seen a lot of companies slow to adopt WAF, and that's a little bit of a mystery to us. But it's at the same time something that you should really definitely look at having legal protection around requiring your vendors to deploy if it's a web-facing application. Be very careful of data in low environments. This is a key issue. I've heard other speakers talk about it on this topic, but again, you should actually have legal protections about the not permitting the vendor to do that. So that way, if they do breach that confidence, you've got some ability to follow up with that on the legal side. And key management and segregation. Again, a lot of these are shared environments, and that's acceptable. We'd like to see, preferably, that the keys are separate by customer. And if they're not, how are they segregating those things? And how is the key management done? If they're not segregating the keys, let's say it's a single key for all customers in that shared environment, how often are they rotating those keys? Because that would be a concern. I'd say you'd look for 12 to 24 months tops, no more than 2 years. And I'd really prefer to see 12-month rotation of keys just for good security hygiene. An ability to leverage APIs if able. Again, you probably want some language around there to ability to leverage that at some point, and you already have legal protections in the contract, so that once you decide that that's something you want to do with the vendor, you don't have to go back to the contract language and renegotiate. And that's it. I just have the bio page here at the end, so for any Q&A that might want to happen.